This is JCT TV. It's Bible study for the 21st century. I'm fully aware, friends, and thanks for joining us. I'm fully aware of the fact that as I am recording this teaching, you and I, and indeed the entire world for over 12 months now, has been living with the ravages of the pandemic, COVID-19. For a lot of us, it's just too much. Some of you have gone more than what you can bear, and you're just desperately searching for some help. I hope our program can help you a little bit.
Assure you from the inside it is happening. God is our hope. God is all we believe in, this God. And he has called us to be the repairers of wars and to take care of the widow and the orphan in their time of need. And that is exactly what we do. Lives are changing. Why? Because Jesus is Lord. And why? Because Christians have come together as a body. The united body of Christ is coming and saying, it stops with this generation. We break it and we move on.
The kind of religion that God endorses is to care for orphans and widows in their distress, justice, and to keep oneself unpolluted from the world, righteousness.
So friends, last time we were right in the middle of a couple of Sabbath controversies that were, brought right face to face with Jesus because of his apparent flouting of the Sabbath laws. And the accusers were the Pharisees. Last week we looked at the disciples who were in a kind of an ad hoc way harvesting. They were reaping and harvesting grain as they walked through the fields, grabbing the top of some of the sheaves of wheat and rubbing the chaff off and blowing it and then eating the kernels of wheat. Now there's going to be another one, but before we get to that, Jesus said in response to the first accusation about this harvesting and threshing activity of his disciples on the Sabbath, he said, the Son of Man, this is, look at it there, in verse 5 of Luke 6, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. Now, Luke records no rejoinder by the Pharisees to Jesus' declaration. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, he says, and it just hangs there. If there was any verbal pushback, Luke doesn't tell us what it was. But the Pharisees obviously doubled back on their Sabbath day's journey, and I told you last week about what a Sabbath day journey is all about, to regroup and challenge this upstart rabbi on some future occasion. Perhaps they might catch him in some other Sabbath violation. And they did. Because in verse 6, Luke says, now it happened. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and taught. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts and said to the man who had the withered hand, arise and stand here. And he arose and stood. Then Jesus said to them, I'll ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy? And when he had looked around at them all, and between the lines, Luke is saying they were totally silent, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand," and he did so. And his hand was restored as whole as the other. But they, the Pharisees, were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. We've all seen people who, either through the birthing process or through an accident or through some kind of a disease, have a paralyzed hand or arm. I've met a few over the years. I know you have too. It's part of the human condition. And here's a guy in the synagogue as Jesus is teaching. And true to form, the scribes and Pharisees were there too, because they knew that Jesus would be teaching. And they knew the withered hand would be there. And they were hoping that this would be like bait to Jesus, that he would, heal this guy on the day of rest. And they already had their oral law passages memorized, and they were just going to jump on Jesus because of this, okay? But they weren't saying anything at this point. Maybe they were still smarting from the interchange they'd had with Jesus in the grain field. Luke doesn't say. So their rancor was nonverbal, but it was palpable. It was in the air. You could sense their animosity. And Jesus knew it, and he knew what they were thinking, Luke tells us. And so their malice, if you will, was exposed by their grudging silence at Jesus' question, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to harm, to save life or to destroy it?" Total silence. These grim-faced guys. They didn't want to open their mouths and respond to this because it was like a trap. How could any of them say it's good to do evil, or to work that which is harmful on the Sabbath day? So Jesus calls on the man with the withered hand who's sitting there with the Pharisees to stand up and to come to the front where Jesus is teaching. And, I don't know if he was self-righteous or he was just hopeful that something good would happen. I mean, Jesus by reputation was the healer, okay? Anyway, he comes forward. And Jesus calls on him to stretch out his hand. Now think about this for a minute. Here's a guy, his hand has maybe been withered, either from birth or from a stroke, but he's probably been unable to use that hand for a long time, maybe a lifetime, right? And now, this rabbi from the Galilee says to him verbally, "Stretch it out." Would there have been a moment in this man's thinking when he would say, what are you talking about? I can't stretch it out. You've got to, zap me. You got to do something. I've got to feel the power of your presence or your healing influence, flowing into my arm, and then I can stretch it out. He tells the guy to stretch it out before he feels any strength. So what this did is it forced this man to show some faith, right? Maybe he could move it from his shoulder, we don't know. But whatever it took, he stretched it out and was healed even as he stretched it out. Well, Jesus, had no need to repeat what he'd said in the grain field the week before about being Lord of the Sabbath. The Pharisees' mouths were shut, this time now not out of animosity, but out of amazement. I mean, they're human beings. I mean, surely what kind of power does this guy have? I really wonder if instantly they wouldn't have felt some self-doubt about their animosity and their opposition to Jesus. Nevertheless, they say nothing, but what Luke does tell us is that filled with fury, they slunk out to hatch a plan. And as you read the Gospels, you see these Pharisees continually trying to come up with a plan, trying to engage others in a plan, trying somehow to capture Jesus. And of course, the ultimate plan had to be assisted by one of Jesus' own. His name was Judas, later on in the story. Without Judas engaging himself in that betrayal and ultimate crucifixion, I think the Pharisees would never have been able to come up with a plan, because Jesus seemed to be inviolable. I mean, how could you touch this guy unless he somehow passively submitted, right? As a lamb before her as a sheep before her shears is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. Isaiah predicted centuries previous. Okay, so enough said about these Sabbath controversies. Let's pick it up in verse 12. It came to pass in those days that he went out to the mountain to pray, and continued all night in prayer to God. And when it was day, he called his disciples to himself, and from them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles: Simon, whom he also named Peter, Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, Judas Iscariot, who also became a traitor. And he came down with them and stood on a level place with a crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and from the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and be healed of their diseases, as well as those who were tormented with unclean spirits, and they were healed. Now, what we're going to be looking at here, and it's going to take me more than this teaching segment to do this, is what's known as a Sermon on the Plain. We've gone through the Sermon on the Mount when we went through Matthew. This is a Sermon on the Plain. The Upper Galilee is very hilly. It's very difficult to find anything other than slopes and valleys. When I lived and pastored in Jerusalem back in the 1980s, I used to drive from Jerusalem up to southern Lebanon every week to do 2 shifts on a Christian radio station that was situated in an abandoned customs house in southern Lebanon, in the Valley of the Springs, right beneath 2 hogbacks. On the one side was an abandoned village. It was called Klea. On the other side was a still active village called Marjayun, and above both was the ruins of a Crusader castle that was still it looked like a jagged tooth up there. A Beaufort Castle it was called, still is. And in Beaufort Castle, there were a nest of Palestinian militia who, whenever they wanted, with their Katyusha rockets and their mortars, would shell Klea to the point where everybody deserted Klea, and they would shell Metula, which is the northernmost town in Israel, right on the border with southern Lebanon. And I would drive up, and indeed you have to drive up, even though Jerusalem is high, the Upper Galilee is higher. I would come down to the Jordan Valley, 600 feet below sea level, drive along the Jordan Valley to Tiberias, past Tabgha, where Jesus fed the 5,000, and then begin 8 switchbacks up what's now known as the Mount of Beatitudes, and beyond that through to Rosh Pinah, and then from Rosh Pinah way up to Metula. And then with my military pass from the Israelis, I would go into southern Lebanon. It was very hilly, and my little Volkswagen had a real hard time going up those hills. On the way back, I could almost coast all the way to the Sea of Galilee. But the point is, it was hilly. So how in the world would Jesus find a plain in which to teach his disciples and to heal people who were ill? Well, I'll get to that right after this break.
Why dance when you have very little? When you live from day to day with food insecurity, rampant disease, sickness, and death? You dance because your heart is full of love for God and your hope is strong. WOW has come alongside as the hands and feet of the Lord, providing both home-based care and assurance of God's love. You're happy and you've got to dance. Please support WOW. Let's keep them dancing.
So as I said a moment ago, the Upper Galilee is very hilly. And when you're coming north along the Jordan Valley, as I did every week for 7 years in my little Volkswagen, when I got to Tiberias, right there on the Sea of Galilee, I was fully aware of the hills that were ahead of me. There was hills on the west, hills on the east, known as the Golan Heights, hills ahead of me, Mount of Beatitudes, Capernaum over there on the north end of the lake. And I would drive around the lake, and then I would start climbing up to the Upper Galilee all the way to Metula. And then from Metula, with my military pass, I was able to go through the border, through the military checkpoints, right into southern Lebanon, where this little abandoned custom house, which had been made into a radio station, was where I would do a couple of shifts every week, broadcasting the gospel into southern Lebanon and northern Israel. Did that for 7 years, as well as planting the church in Jerusalem. So I know the Upper Galilee really well. I know every hill, and I've not only driven the main highway, sometimes I've gone up to the border on the west, which is just like a military trail, very scary actually, because often there's conflicts up there. But I've gone that way around and down into Metula as well. Very hilly. So how can we call what Jesus is about to do the Sermon on the Plain? Well, the fact is that when you drive through Tiberias, you go a couple of miles right past Magdala, which is the place where Mary Magdalene hailed from. It's now an amazing dig that the Israeli Archaeological Authority has excavated over the past few years. It's just an amazing ruins. If ever you go to Israel, you need to go to Magdala. It was a former commercial fishing center where probably Peter and James and John and many others brought their fish from Capernaum down to be sold and to be processed for distribution to Israel and other parts of the Middle East. You go past Magdala, but just as you get past Magdala, right now it's all beautiful citrus and banana groves, but it's a flat plain that maybe 1,000 acres, I don't know. It's quite big. And then if you continue around the lake past Capernaum, you get to Bethsaida, which is on the northeast coast of the Sea of Galilee, and there's another plain there. So you've got these two plains. The one just north of Magdala is called the plain of Gennesaret, and the other one, I'm not sure what its name is, the plain of Bethsaida, I'm not sure. But this level area called Gennesaret, which is sort of bounded by Capernaum in the north and Magdala on the southwest, it probably is the place where this happened. And it could very well be that when it says Jesus went up into the mountain to pray, I mean, the mountain from which he preached the Sermon on the Mount is right there. It's one of the mountains that edges onto Gennesaret. Luke doesn't tell us which one it was. There's several other hills, of course, available. There's one up there more directly to the west, where there's a beautiful ancient village, but Luke doesn't tell us. Anyway, it's referred to as a Sermon on the Plain to distinguish it from the Sermon on the Mount. The plain sermon is more succinct, it's more compact than the Sermon on the Mount, but the essential content is similar. I'm a preacher. I've been a preacher for all of my life. I started preaching in youth services when I was 14. But I have pastored a number of churches, planted King of Kings Church in Jerusalem, Israel, as many of you know, back in the 80s. And I'm very familiar as a preacher with preaching the same sermon more than once. Yet even though the content is the same, hang on, I just lost something here. There we go. Even though the content is the same, the delivery and the emphasis is always adapted to the given time, the place, and the congregation to whom I'm speaking. I see no need then to attempt to reconcile the Sermon on the Plain with the Sermon on the Mount, as some commentators do. Jesus' message was fluid. It wasn't static. And some, commentators just do back, flips trying to make these into the same sermon. Obviously, they're not preachers. There's no need to do that. Jesus' message, and pardon me for using a colorful metaphor here, but Jesus' message flowed like a river from town to town, working over the souls of men and women with the transforming water of life. I mean, it was fluid. It was not static. Okay? So, he spends a night of prayer somewhere on a mountain, as the King James Version says, or a hill, as the RSV says, mountainside, as the NIV says, whatever. Luke writes that Jesus called a larger group of disciples to join him. Now, everybody knew he was there. And I've made this point before, I'll make it again. We talk about the disciples, we think of the 12, as they're called, with a capital T, the 12. They were the inner group. There was even an inner group within the inner group called the 3, Peter, James, and John. But apart from the 12, there were another 100 or so, maybe 120, who were very involved with Jesus' itinerations and ministry. And then there were other hangers-on, and then there were gawkers, and then there were the sick, and there were the demon-possessed. And what Luke tells us here is that there's people from Judea, from Jerusalem, from the coast towns of Tyre and Sidon, meaning that from Tyre and Sidon, and I've been there, I've been in those places during some of the horrors of war back in the 80s. From Tyre and Sidon down to the plain of Gennesaret is a long, long way to walk. I've driven it up, very difficult for my little car, and down. I've never walked it. If you walk it, it's got to be at least a couple of days walk, if not more, depending on the temperature. Anyway, there's this huge crowd there waiting for Jesus. And he, again, Luke doesn't tell us why he did this, but he calls a group of disciples to him, and this would be maybe 120, 200 of them. Out of them, Luke tells us he selected the 12. Now, the other gospel writers have different accounts of how Jesus selected the 12, and that's cool. Each of them has their own perspective, their own history, and I'm happy with that. There's no point in trying to harmonize the Gospels, friends, because if you harmonize the Gospels, you'll just back yourself into a corner of manipulating the Gospels. I don't go there. Anyway, he chooses 12 from this group. Simon, renamed Peter the Rock. Andrew, who was Peter's brother. James and John, who were the sons of, I think, a wealthy commercial fisherman by the name of Zebedee. You got Philip from Bethsaida. You got Bartholomew, Matthew, and Thomas, the twin, Didymus, the twin. You have James, the son of Alphaeus. You got Simon, called the Zealot. He was some kind of political activist. You got Judas, the son of James. And you have another Judas, known as Iscariot, which means man of Keriot. And these are the 12. There's no reference to an induction ceremony or any instructions by Jesus. If there were, Luke doesn't care to tell us. Just simply, Luke says, he came down with them and stood in the plain. And this huge crowd of needy people are waiting for him. Then, healing them all, verse 20, he lifts up his eyes towards his disciples and says this. Now, here we are. Reflections of the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm not going to get through all of this now, but I'll start. I've got a few minutes before I've got to take a break. He starts with what we'll call the 4 Beatitudes, by 4 counterpoint, followed by 4 counterpoint woes. Blessed and woe. Blessed and woe. The contrast is stark. Let's look at it. Blessed are you poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you shall be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh. Blessed are you when men hate you, and when they exclude you and revile you, and cast out your name as evil for the Son of Man's sake. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for indeed your reward is great in heaven, for in like manner their fathers did to the prophets. No. But then he follows with woe. Woe to you who are rich, you've received your consolation. Woe to you who are full, you shall hunger. Woe to you who laugh now, you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for so did their fathers to the prophets. Okay. Blessings and woes. He doesn't frame them that way in what we call the Sermon on the Mount. This is essentially the same content, but it's a different crowd, it's a different context, and I think in many ways a different application. So rather than get into that, I think I'll take a little break. I'll just remind you this, friends. I hope that when you're following along JCT, you see the scripture, of course, on the screen behind me, but it'd be great if you had your own Bible open as well, and just kind of, make a few notes and a little underlining or highlighting or whatever as we go along, because I'm hoping that this is a stimulus to your own study. That is a hope I have every time I open the scriptures to teach. I'll be back right after this.
WOW works with local churches in needy countries. We mobilize those churches, pastors, and volunteers in a concerted effort to care for orphans and widows in their homes and villages. Through that strong faith-based platform, we're able to not only provide food, medicine, and crisis intervention, but we're also able to lead these afflicted ones to faith in God. It's powerful, humbling, and well worth the effort. Please support WOW with your generous gifts and faithful prayer. Thank you.
Friends, you see the promos for WOW, Working for Orphans and Widows, which is a mission that my wife and I started back in 1999. It's been an amazing ministry. It just keeps growing and growing and growing, even during these COVID times. And I make no excuses for this. I'm just very happy that JCT can be the official voice of WOW and provide you the opportunity to be an investor in this remarkable work that's going on with orphans and widows in South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, and also southern India. One thing we're doing that might surprise you is that in Malawi alone, we are involved in the training of about 70 pastors and church leaders who are overseeing just under 14,000 people in various churches and Bible study groups who are training them in the gospel, as we're trying to do with the program, and also modeling for them justice in ministering to orphans and widows.